welcome to this episode of Text for Nothing Conversation with Poets. And my guest tonight is Ruth Lepson. And I just wanted to say this show started exactly a year ago. And it was Michael Franco who was my first guest, and Ruth is now my guest. Thank you so much for coming.
Michael.
So, as always, all the information on her work, links, biography, all of that is in the website, which is textfornothingtv.com. And so to start, I wanted to first thank you for accepting my invitation, and then talk about the the sense that I have in your work of the poems being a reflection of your perceptions of bodies in space. Like you connect to different objects, to different people, to different perceptions, but it seems to be the language of the poem is registering all that is happening around it and how it affects the inner life of that voice.
Oh, I never thought of it as bodies in space, but I see what you mean because I tend to be very outer directed,
Right.
which is strange for a poet, nevertheless. And sight is really important to me. It's
Right.
really important to me. And sight is what moves me the most generally. And I love that feeling of going to an art gallery, when you come out and for a few hours everything looks like a painting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I appreciate noticing little things too, or things that are considered less than beautiful, the way that William Carlos Williams writes, like By the Road to the Contagious Hospital, when he writes about the weeds and the dead bushes and so on, and then gradually they come back to life, or the broken green glass, all those things, they really move me incredibly.
Right, right. And so, and how does it go from your perception as a person to your work as a poet? Like how does that how the perception moves into language? Because that's the other pole that I've seen in your work.
Well, I'm glad you noticed those two things. The older I get, the more I concentrate on sound.
Right.
And so many times, for example, driving back from the conservatory, driving along Memorial Drive at sunset, I would see, the zigzag of all the colored lights in the water.
Right.
I must have written 100 poems about that, I
Yeah.
just pull over and write on the back of my checkbook.
Oh, really?
Not actually on Memorial Drive, but as soon as
Yeah,
I got
yeah,
off
yeah.
it,
Yeah.
And sometimes those poems turned out fairly well, but sometimes they didn't because the sound wasn't there.
Right.
And Creeley has been a big mentor to me. I think he's a real master of sound. And Williams, I've been reading again lately, and the way that they use sound to, well, it's inseparable. It's
Yeah.
inseparable from the image. And so it's not so much that I think about the sound on a conscious level as that now sometimes I'll start with a phrase and I'll let the vowels and consonants and rhythm of the phrase take me to the next phrase, even if I had no intention of doing so.
Right.
And I find that more interesting, really. And also in recent years, sometimes I've done something I hadn't before, which is listen to music while I wrote.
Oh. What kind of
Because-
music do you listen to?
Well, classical or jazz mainly.
Okay.
And something that is not too intrusive.
Right.
But Creeley always used to listen to music, jazz in particular, when he wrote.
Right,
And that
right.
amazed me. He said it took him away from his own mind.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so I heard that and I thought, okay, I know what he's talking about. It doesn't have to interfere with the rhythms of the poem. It can just take you away from your immediate concerns or those strings of things that you think about all day.
Right.
Like Gertrude Stein said, most people think about the same 3 or 4 things all their life.
Right.
And I have mine. And my ways of perceiving things, and the degree to which I can get away from them is the degree to which I can feel free to have fun in the poem.
Right.
You know?
Right. And so you said that now you're starting with a phrase.
Yeah.
And that was, how was it before? Like there was an idea or an image or?
Well, it would be an image that would turn into a phrase, but the phrase wouldn't necessarily lead to the next phrase musically.
Oh,
It
right,
would
right,
lead
right, right.
perceptually,
I see.
visually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, tried to make the poem coherent in that way.
Right, from the beginning, from the outset of the composition.
Yeah. And,
Right.
And I got tired of that. It just was not finally what poetry is to me. I mean, I started reading Eliot and Hopkins when I was in high school, and it was really the sounds as much as the images that took
Right.
me over.
Right.
And so that's when I started writing.
Right. Yeah. To me, that is also the what is the intangible essence of poetry is the sound.
Yeah.
And that all to me there's two definitions that I always sort of think when people say, oh, what is a poem? Like pound, words set to music, or Paul Valéry, the distance between music. I don't exactly know what the quote is, but something like the ambiguity or the inability to decide between sound and sense.
Yeah.
And so those, to me, that is essential. If a poem doesn't flow musically, there is no poem.
As Olson and then Olson said, and then Creeley added the second part is no separation between the sound and the form.
Right, right.
And I think that the sound is the sense, and the sense is the sound.
Right.
That's how you get people to feel the sound, even if they're not consciously aware of it.
Right. And that's what makes a poem rather than just a text that is broken down in different lines, or that is even following a beat, because a beat doesn't necessarily mean the sound of the poem.
Sure.
The stress of the syllables is something that has been used, and it can be used, but it's not necessarily the to write in a pentameter doesn't mean that you're writing a poem. Yeah. Okay. So and now there's perception is also very present in your poems. There's a lot of use of the verbs of to see, to look, to gaze, to stare, to hear, to feel, to touch. So that is also what I was thinking about. There's a poem in Dreaming in Color, which I lose myself in towns.
Yeah.
There is this sense of being surrounded by the world, and how you relate to that through your perceptions.
Perceptive of you. That's how I feel, surrounded
Right,
by the
right.
towns.
Right. And how does that happen? But I'm interested in the conversion of perception into language, because then you have that book, which is a morphology, where you use photographs and the text. You also play with the size of the text.
Yeah.
It seems like the page also becomes a space where you can sort of do different things.
That's right, and Christina Strong, who's a wonderful poet, actually did the layout for that book. So she's almost a third collaborator there. But these are actually prose poems, very different in kind from what I've done before, and they are just snippets from actual dreams.
Oh, really?
And I have 80 of my own photographs in there.
Yes.
And then I have photographs by Rusty Crump, who's a professional photographer. And the reason for putting my own photographs in there is to show the relationship between the waking state and the dreaming state.
Oh, okay.
Not that there's a one-to-one correspondence,
Of course.
but there's an overlap, yeah.
Right. And what prompted you to do the project? Was it...
Oh. It's hard to remember. It was many years ago, and I guess it was a period when I was interested in writing down my dreams.
Right.
So, of course, if you write down a dream, usually it's very long.
Yeah.
And I started looking at them after a while, I guess, and thought, well, most of this can just go. And I'm interested in the synesthetic parts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mostly they're synesthesia, but sometimes they're maybe two images that are connected that I find intriguing. Why do I have this after that?
Right, right. And also, there's a lot of embodying other people.
Embodying other
Yeah,
people?
there's like I was this person, and
yeah.
yeah, which is also, I guess, a different way of perceiving.
And you know how that happens in dreams. You're suddenly somebody else, and
Right.
somebody else is you, and then you're yourself again, and people just morph from one to another. That's one reason I called it morphology.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
I thought it had to do with the way it was the text was disposed
Well,
on the
that's
page.
part of it, yeah.
Right, right. But you didn't do the disposition on the text. That was Christina who did it.
Right.
Oh, I see, I see. Interesting. And so, and this is, do you have any more experiments like this? And have you continued with that side of your work?
No, but just today, I was reading a book on alchemy,
Huh.
and from a Jungian point of view.
Right.
And it's about the symbols, the archetypes, and the psychology. It's a fascinating book, and part of it is about dreams and the ways in which different cultures handle dreams. And it turns out that many ancient cultures perpetuate or save or discuss dreams that many people have. And if one person has something else in the dream that's a little bit different, they discard it. And so it's not really a person's original dream, it's the way in which the person is influenced by the community.
Right.
Whereas, interestingly, the Alaskans seem to do the opposite. And the person who wrote the book, who was a colleague of Jung, seems to think that's because life was so incredibly difficult for the Alaskans. They're just trying to survive. They don't have time to think about their dreams. So there are only a few people in the community who do the deep dreaming, and they
Right.
talk very specifically about what it is that they're doing.
Right.
And then the book goes into a discussion of individuation, how you become yourself.
Right.
You have to have a community feeling to empathize, but to do something original, you have to individuate.
Right. Right.
So I've just been thinking about things like that recently for various reasons, and so who knows what'll come out of that. It's not going to be like this, but
something.
maybe go back to dreams as a source of the original, of the real unconscious, which is not mediated by the culture trying to make it more communal.
Right. Well, for me, that's one of the aspects of surrealism that I'm interested in. Is not so much the automatic writing, but the idea of that having that access to the subconscious and how that influences or how that is manifested in especially in art. So I'm interested in sort of hearing how do you, even though you're not writing your dreams anymore, are they part of your creative process, or they just
Not lately, but I think it's coming back, as
Right.
I say. But in dreams there are symbols, there are metaphors, there are things morphing, and the kind of poetry that I especially love doesn't have much figurative language in it.
right?
I like William Carlos Williams' style, in which, he gives you some images, wonderful sense of rhythm, and the perception of the writer talking about his environment, and then lets the reader fill in the rest.
Right.
And so that's what appeals to me the most. However, when a metaphor is really great, as it is in Baudelaire, for example, then that's terrific too. But it seems to me it's too far removed from the original thing that I'm trying to get at.
Right.
I'm trying to get at something so ordinary.
Right.
You make a metaphor I remember I took a class with Ann Sexton, and excuse me, Ann, wherever you are, for saying this. And there was a guy in the class who was having trouble writing. He had a writer's block, and so he said, "Can you help me with that?" And she said, "You see that black porcelain dog on the mantelpiece? Tell me everything that it is not. It's not a book, it's not an elbow, it's not a street light. That's how you write a poem." And I thought, no, it isn't. That's way too arbitrary.
Right.
Because so many kinds of figurative language don't strike at the emotional core. They are
Yep.
somewhat arbitrary. But I've just been teaching Emily Dickinson, and boy, can she, I brought along one poem.
Oh yeah,
first.
let's listen to it.
She's as good as Baudelaire. Because she embodies truly the things that she's making metaphors about. So, poem number 204 for those of you who want to investigate. I'll tell you how the sun rose, a ribbon at a time. The steeples swam in amethyst, the news like squirrels ran. The hills untied their bonnets, the bobolinks begun. Then I said softly to myself, that must have been the sun. But how he set, I know not. There seemed a purple stile, that little yellow boys and girls were climbing all the while, till when they reached the other side, a dominie in gray put gently up the evening bars and led the flock away. So a dominie is a schoolmaster, and the style, it's the steps that you walk up to climb over something.
Okay.
And the yellow boys and girls were climbing all the while because in the morning the sun is yellow, and
Right.
at night the color in the sky often is purple. And the yellow boys and girls were climbing all the while, but he leads them away. They're leading the flock away. So the sun rose a ribbon at a time. The steeples swam in amethyst. The news like squirrels ran. Now that's a simile that's hard to beat, huh? Isn't
Yeah.
that fantastic? And the hills untied their bonnets. She really loves to personify, and it's hard to do, but she does it so well. Then I said softly to myself, that must have been the sun, but how he set, I know not. And so things become more mysterious as it heads towards sunset.
Right.
And who is this schoolmaster who's taking the yellow kids who began in the sunlight over to the purple side and leading them like a flock away? What's going to happen to them?
Right. And who is that person or that?
Well, she would like to believe that it's God, but she is honest enough to struggle with her faith all her life, and
Yeah.
finally she doesn't really believe.
Right.
So something. The death is the door the wall, she says, you can never get past. And so you can't know. And so she tried to have faith, but she
Right.
couldn't have faith.
Right. She needed to have that perception and that awareness of it cannot be based on faith.
Yeah, because she was hoping to be reunited with the people she loved and lost, which for her was absolutely crushing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she didn't really believe they were going to be reunited.
Right. And so, what is the place of Emily Dickinson in your work and in your? When did you started reading her? What is the?
Well, of course, I started reading her like everybody else taught in high school and so on. But over the course of my life, I haven't paid that much attention. I go in and I go out. Each time I come back, I see so much more in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm really struck this time by the honesty, her fear, her hope, her despair, her joy, and her ability to express those in a very extreme way. So much poetry is considered good if it's understated.
Right.
And I never thought that that had to be the case.
Yeah, yeah.
But in order to overstate, you have to be as great as Emily Dickinson.
Right. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, people are going to back off.
And photography, and that is also that the images are so clear. The images move through the poem. The images are so perfectly presented to the reader. There's that presentation of image in your work as well. To me, that seemed, when I saw that you took pictures, that seemed like a natural step. Do you still take pictures? Are you still engaged in photography, or?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm obsessed with taking pictures on my phone.
Oh, really?
I really don't know anything technically, but
Right.
a few photographers have told me I have some talent, so I thought maybe when I retire, I'll learn some of the technical aspects.
Right.
But visual arts are very important to me. The summer before last, I took a painting class, and again, I had no idea what I was doing, but I love the feel of the oil paints. I love moving the paints around. I love to see the way the colors mix, and I have to look at paintings regularly.
Right. What kind of
Like
paintings do you
Cézanne.
like? Cézanne.
Cézanne, Sargent, Gerhard Richter.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And, I've taken other art courses too. But there's some relationship, I think, between poetry and film and poetry and photography that I'd like to find out about a little more.
Right. Have you ever taken part in a film or an experimental video?
No, I keep trying to get people to let me do it. No takers yet. If there's anybody out there who wants to, I'm there.
Nice. Because that is the perception of is the interesting thing is a perception of when I read your work is noticing your perception of the world.
Yeah.
And you're not presenting the world as if it were like a neutral place that I can like look at. I'm not looking into the world.
Yeah.
I'm just getting to know your perception of it.
How can I? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't.
Yeah. But there's poets who would try that, or there's ways of trying to present something a little bit more objective.
Well,
but it's
some
not.
people say William Carlos Williams was describing the world the way it was, and couldn't be further from the truth. He knew everything is the imagination.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Especially him.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what other poets are you mentioned Creeley, you've mentioned Williams and Dickinson. What other poets are
Yeats when I was in college was enormously important to me, and the objectivist poets and the other Black Mountain poets. And Denise Levertov was a big influence on me for a while, as was Adrienne Rich for other reasons.
right?
Adrienne Rich, I do think Adrienne Rich is really a master of sound and rhythm, which a lot of
she's
people
wonderful.
don't notice. They
Yeah.
think that she's writing some feminist cliches, and it couldn't be farther from the truth.
Yeah.
She's so large-hearted, like Whitman. She encompasses multitudes, and you feel the rhythms of her body and her heart and of her speech, and she has a way of being inclusive and fluid that I thought was really striking.
And do you also write prose, like essays, or is there any, or do you concentrate mainly in writing poems?
Well, I write book reviews sometimes.
Okay.
And I've written some essays about poets, but fiction, no talent.
No, it's a hard. Something like Fanny Ho can how big can make
Well, it's
that.
funny you should mention Fanny. You know, she's a good friend of mine, and she's a great fiction writer, and so I keep trying to get her to say things that will enable me to write fiction. And she said, "Ruth, if you haven't done it by now, just forget about it." And then she said, "You tell great stories at dinner, isn't that enough for you?" And I said, "No, if I tell great stories at dinner, can't I translate them onto the page?"
Right.
So I told her a story that I've always wanted to tell that's based on what really happened to me when I was hitchhiking around the country. I wanted to connect certain things. And she listened to it and she said, it's never going to cohere. She said, why don't you write about the day that your grandmother died and how your grandfather reacted? You told me about that. And I said, what am I going to say about that? It's just, it's an anecdote. It's not a story.
Right.
And what am I supposed to say about it anyway? And she said, just write it as you told me, but I couldn't really
Right.
do anything with
Do
it.
the tell the narrative is not exactly the same as.
Yeah, and besides this, the short story writers that I admire the most are people like Henry James or Graham Greene, who can, and Edith Wharton, fantastic. And I read Elizabeth Hardwick this summer, and they can really develop character through plot.
Right.
And I just can't imagine how one would go about that.
Right.
And so I don't want to just write some kind of experimental fiction that doesn't contain that. Doesn't interest me, even though I love some people who do that.
Yeah.
Including some young writers. What's that book? The War Room. I recently read by. Is it Mary Kushner? Mary Kushner. I read a story of hers in the New Yorker, and I was blown away. And I got this book. It's about a woman who commits murder, and at the beginning of the book, she's riding on a night bus being taken to prison with others.
Oh wow.
And then there are flashbacks, and you get to know the characters in the prison also.
Right.
And the dialogue and the wisdom are so believable. It knocked me out. I thought,
Right.
She's not Dostoevsky, but maybe she will be something like that someday. And
Right.
I just can't think that way. I'd love to read Dostoevsky, but
So, what is your? We have a few seconds left. What is your reading sort of regiment to call it?
yeah. I guess I keep spiritual books by my bed. So maybe a history of God.